Oh, howdy all. Grab yourselves a beer. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Today, I wanted to talk about the newly revealed Spellslinger Support. Now, Spellslinger is a build-enabling gem. It's something that's designed for a new style of wand caster, and the core concept is that as you fire your wand and strike enemies with it, it will cause whatever spell you have attached to Spellslinger to explode in the direction of that monster. So very much like a build-your-own poet's pen. So, it's important to note that Spellslinger Support is completely untested, and quite frankly, it could be bad. The numbers on it are looking somewhat promising. They don't look amazing, but they look good enough that I'm reasonably confident to try this as a league starter. I'm going to suggest, though, that you want to have a backup plan if you decide to league start in the Delirium League with this build, because, once more, it's untested and it might just be bad. So, my backup plan here is that the passive tree that I've built is very, very similar to that for a cast on critical strike assassin, which is a well-tried and tested build that, whilst it really doesn't come into its own completely until you've got a lot of really high-end gear, it is serviceable when you don't have that gear. It's not like it's a dumpster tier build until you hit a certain point. It's always going to work, and so for that reason, I'm happy to start with the league with it, because you've got the fallback plan of just respecking completely into the cast on crit assassin. So, without anything further about the Spellslinger Support, let's have a quick look at the passive tree that I'm thinking of setting up here. So, we'll jump across to Path of Building, which is a program that you really should download if you haven't already got it and you play Path of Exile. So, the assassin allows incredible scaling of critical strikes. So, without saying anything more, let's have a quick look at what the assassin grants us. There's Mistwalker, which is defensive primarily. There is Opportunistic, which is also defensive in that your damage from your critical strikes cannot be reflected. But it also gives you considerably more damage in certain situations where you might struggle. In particular, 25% more damage when there is at most one rare or unique enemy nearby. 20% increased movement speed if you've killed recently is a huge buff as well, both both defensively, because it lets you get the hell out of enemy attacks, and also offensively because it lets you do your movement that you need to do faster. So Opportunistic is a really good node. But the core of the assassin is in two parts. Unstable Infusion grants one maximum power charge and a very reliable source of power charges. This allows you to constantly be critically striking from early in the game. And then Deadly Infusion gives you tremendous buffs when you are at maximum power charges, with 8% critical strike multiplier per power charge, but most importantly, plus 2% critical strike chance when at maximum power charges. 2% doesn't sound like much, but what this allows you to do is to get critical strikes on skills that don't otherwise allow them at all, and I'm particularly thinking of Herald of Ice here. Herald of Ice, in conjunction with Deadly Infusion, is then capable of critically striking because it has that 2% base crit, and then you can scale that from other sources. Additionally, 10% increased movement speed while at maximum power charges. I think I've been talking too much already about how good movement speed is, but movement speed is good. So, that's the reasons that we're going to be going with the Assassin. In pretty mech gear, it's possible to hit more than 60% critical strike chance, and this then translates during a Diamond Flask uptime to an 85% or higher critical strike chance. When you do critically strike, you'll deal quintuple damage, and you will also inflict freezes. So, lots of good stuff there, and that's the reason that we're going to be doing it. So, Spellslinger Support is not yet supported in Path of Building, this program that's been designed for purposes of planning out builds. And so for that reason, I've just had to sort of wing it a little bit and set up Glacial Cascade as though I was manually casting it. Now, what we're going to be doing here is attaching it to Spellslinger. Spellslinger has two main components. Firstly, you need to make a wand attack, and that wand attack then triggers all of the spells that are linked to Spellslinger. That is what I term the payload skill, and here our payload skill is going to be Glacial Cascade. So we're going to use Frenzy as our trigger. Frenzy's damage is going to be derisory, and so we're not even going to try and scale it. Any damage that it does is just going to be a little incidental bonus. Frenzy is going to be linked to either chain or greater multiple projectiles. I'm not going to say one of these in particular. I'm going to suggest that you experiment with both. Find out which one you think works best for you. It's then going to be linked to Curse on Hit and Frostbite. Frostbite causes enemies to take considerably more damage from any source of cold damage that you can inflict on them, and given that we're mostly dealing cold damage, this is a huge buff. Curse on Hit allows us to basically inflict that curse at very little to no opportunity cost. I think that Chain synergizes with Curse on Hit better than greater multiple projectiles would have. However, sometimes monsters might just move out of the way between you activating Frenzy and them being hit, and for that reason, there are certainly merits to greater multiple projectiles. It's a lot harder to dodge greater multiple projectiles than a greater multiple projectiles Frenzy than it is for enemies to just accidentally dodge a chaining one where there's not additional projectiles to either side. So, Glacial Cascade then deals high damage in a large area, and it will almost always freeze or one-shot weaker enemies, which then allows our Herald of Ice to proc and cause those enemies to explode. So let's have a quick talk about the mechanics of Glacial Cascade, and that is going to be a jump across to the skill gem in the Path of Exile wiki. So Glacial Cascade deals a heavy amount of physical damage. However, that physical damage then gets converted to cold damage. This means that by default, it's dealing part physical and part cold damage. This can be quite tricky to scale. A lot of things that will increase the amount of cold damage that you're doing will then not buff the amount of physical damage that you're doing. My solution for this is going to be to use the unique gloves Hrim Sorrow. These are very available in a trade league, even on day one. And in conjunction with Hrim Sorrow, the conversion will hit 110%. In practice, that actually only means 100%. So the extra 10% will be wasted. You're going to have 60% of your physical damage converted from Glacial Cascade the gem, and the 40% that remains will all be converted by Hrim Sorrow. So you'll be converting all of your damage to cold, and therefore you only need to try and scale cold damage. You don't need to try and mess around with scaling both physical and cold damage simultaneously. Now, there are better solutions that will be available later in a league to do this conversion for you. The first one is the Long Winter Unique Jewel. This can be a bit tricky to get on day one of a league. It's not that it's expensive, it's just there's not many of them around, and that can make them expensive very early on. They'll be very cheap later in the league, and in fact, they're a good opportunity for you to seek them out with 15% increased cold damage, so a perfect roll, and also to then hit them with Varlords, which can then give you some very powerful implicit modifiers as an added bonus. But that's something for later in the league. Start with Hrim Sorrow. Hrim Sorrow is good enough. In fact, as well as Hrim Sorrow, you can also upgrade it to Hrim Burn, which allows your cold damage to ignite, which will just deal a small amount of extra damage, and is pure upgrade if you can get that Prophecy Fire and Ice, and then you just need to go and kill Hailrake with it. So, the way that we're going to be linking up our Glacial Cascade is the next thing we need to discuss. Spellslinger, which I've not been able to model in here, is going to be linked to Glacial Cascade, to Controlled Destruction, to Concentrated Effect, to Added Cold Damage, and to Power Charge on Critical. The choice of these supports is somewhat constrained by the fact that Spellslinger reserves 20% of your mana by default, and then this gets multiplied by the mana multiplier on all of your support gems. For this reason, there's a number of quite powerful support gems that I might like to use in place of Power Charge on Critical and in place of other options, but I'm just not able to justify them because they just don't quite have they don't quite pack enough wallop for the amount that they increase the reservation. Keep in mind, we're going to want to be using a Falling Herald of Ice as well. So for that reason, this setup is going to reserve 52% of your mana. That's a considerable amount, but it is a manageable amount. We're then going to be reserving 37% with Herald of Ice when we get to that later. Now, what we're going to do early in endgame, we're going to be putting these gems, including Spellslinger Support, into a tabula rasa, if you can get your hands on one of those early on. Until you can get yourself a tabula, just use Glacial Cascade, Spellslinger Support, and any two of these support gems with it. Power charge on critical will underperform until the point that you get all 7 of your power charges. Sorry, is it 7? No, it's 8, yeah, it's 7 power charges that you'll have with the basic gear setup. So for that reason, you might decide to drop power charge on critical strikes and then just drop one of the others as well. These may not be the optimal gem links later in the league when you have better gear, but as I say, we need to make compromises at the moment because Spellslinger reserves a lot of mana, and also because of the available gear that exists now. Later in the league, we might be able to upgrade to better things, and at that point, I'll make a new video if I end up playing this. So, secondly, we're going to be talking about the Herald of Ice setup. Herald of Ice is an extremely satisfying skill. If you've never used it, it's just awesome. As well as adding flat cold damage to all of your attacks, which is not to your attacks and your spells, which is not all that significant. It causes any enemy that you shatter, which means by default that means killing a frozen enemy. They explode and they deal a big chunk of cold damage. The dream scenario is that if you can get these shatters to chain react, so you kill one enemy, it explodes, dealing cold damage to everything around it. That cold damage freezes those enemies, and then they in turn die and explode. That's the dream scenario, and that's what we're going for here with a 4-linked Herald of Ice. We're linking Herald of Ice to increase critical strikes. I mentioned before that the Assassin Ascendancy gives us a 2% chance to critically hit, a 2% base crit when you have the maximum number of power charges. This is another source of base crit. 1.9% to critical strike chance is base crit. And then on top of that, we get this nice 88% increased critical strike chance. So just to explain the maths behind this, you total up all your sources of base crit. At the moment, that's 3.9%, assuming that we have a level 20 increased critical strikes. To be a bit more realistic earlier in the league, let's say you've only got level 17, then it's 1.8 plus 2, that's 3.8, going up to 3.9 later on. Then that is multiplied by all of the different sources of increased critical strike chance that you've got. So you see increased critical strikes, the gem gives 88%. So that will be a multiplier on this 3.9% base crit that you've got, as will various other sources of increased critical strikes on equipment that you've got. All of that together, and also your Ice Golem, which will give you a little bit of crit as well. All this together will then provide a total critical strike chance. With the gear that I've put into Path of Building, it's at 27.22%, which then is raised to 47% when you are using a Diamond Flask. We can get much better than this with middle tier or endgame tier gear, so this is just a starting point. This Herald of Ice combination is going to reserve 37% of your mana, and so between the two, the 6-link Spellslinger and the Herald of Ice, we're reserving 89% of mana. That's a lot, but it's not unmanageable. Next up, in terms of utility skills, we're going to use Flame Dash, and Flame Dash needs to be linked to Arcane Surge, which for some reason I haven't added in there yet, to Arcane Surge, to Faster Casting, and to Flame Dash. This is something that will let you zip around fast. We're going to use Summon Ice Golem. It doesn't need to be linked to anything, and it's just there because it provides a little bit of extra critical strike chance for you while it's alive. This guy's going to be a little bit useful for you. He is, just in terms of the amount of damage that he adds, it's only a small amount that he adds to Herald of Ice, but it's there. And to Glacial Cascade, it's a little bit more significant, but it's still not a massive amount, just a couple of percent. You could instead use a Flame Golem if you prefer, which will also give you damage. Or if you want to go defensive, you can use a Stone Golem or a Chaos Golem. It's really up to you. Or a lot of people choose not to use a Golem at all. I can certainly get behind that. Finally, we have the Frenzy setup that I was outlining before. So these are all of the gems that I want to suggest using. In terms of equipment, I have deliberately set this up with things that I feel I could easily get on day one. You'll notice that the Taste of Hate Sapphire Flask, which is not going to be available on day one of a league, that is currently deactivated. So it's not counting into the amount of damage you do. If you do get one, it's nice. It adds several percent extra damage. It's really good. And it's also a powerful defensive layer, but you're not necessarily going to be able to get that. So, in terms of wands, these just add spell damage, cold damage to spells, +1 to the level of gems. These are sort of okay wands. They're pretty good, maybe, but I think there's something that you could probably be able to trade for early on. Deliberately, I've gone for a prophecy wand, which is not the strongest option. You'd be looking better off going for an imbued wand, which has faster attacks, or an opal wand, which gives more damage to spells. But I'm just factoring in that you may not be able to get exactly what you want. The general accessory pieces are pretty terrible, and they're a mismatch. All they are is life and resist items, except the belt has a little bit of damage on it. Then we've got the Tabula Rasa and the Hrim Sorrow. And then from a flask perspective, Atziri's Promise might actually be hard to get on day one, especially given that this build will have a little bit of trouble with Atziri's split phase, possibly, from uncontrolled chains. Although, no, I think that can be managed. So it'll be manageable for Atziri, but it's not essential, but it does add a huge amount of damage. And also gives the benefit of chaos resistance and a small amount of life recovery from the chaos damage being leached as life. So this flask is amazing. It's usually very cheap by day 3 or 4 of a league, and because of the unique mechanics of Glacial Cascade, you're actually going to want, your aspirational goal is to get a perfectly rolled one. So that means 2% chaos damage leech, that's the only roll it can be. You're going to want 20% of physical and 15% of elemental as added chaos. The elemental roll is more important, so the damage that you do is more sensitive to the elemental roll than it is to the physical roll, but both of the rolls are good. We're going to want a critical strike enhancing flask, and here I've just got something that I think is pretty reasonable to get, an Experimenter's Diamond Flask of Warding. Warding deals with all pesky curses in a map, and as long as you're able to regenerate 20 charges every 6.2 seconds, you'll be able to keep this up. Skip over Taste to Hate, just until you can get your hands on that. Just use whatever flask you want, some utility flask. There's a lot of power that you can get out of the Wise Oak flask, but that can be difficult to use early on in a league. If you can get your hands on one though, definitely consider it. Ample Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline, and a Seething Divine Life Flask of Staunching. Don't underestimate how good a Divine Life Flask of Staunching is. From a Jewels perspective, I've gone with mid-tier Jewels here. They've got life, they've got a single critical strike multiplier roll, and they've got a small amount of added cold damage on them. These would be Jewels I'd be pretty happy to have early on. I'll probably end up settling for something worse than this, but it's not hard to roll something that is at least serviceable early in a league. You may want to use fossils on Jewels at this point, with all the changes to how fossils work. Using frigid and pristine fossils together, should be able to roll something along these lines in a reasonably small number of attempts. So that's the budget basement gear. That's the dumpster tier stuff. The aspirational upgrades need to be discussed. So firstly, there is the anointment. If you're on a budget, your amulet should be boosted with diamond skin. Later in the league, go with Constitution or Solar Steel, I think. But of course, remain flexible here. This is the sort of thing that needs to be tested in practice. So, Tabula Rasa is the worst possible 6-link. This can be upgraded to similar unique items early in a league. You might be able to get your hands on a correct color Skin of the Loyal or Skin of the Lords, or you could trade for a 6-link spellcaster chest with good mods, such as socketed spells have a plus X% base chance to crit, or killed enemies explode, dealing 3% of their life as physical damage. These are not going to be available early in the league, however. The ultimate chest, I believe, is going to be the Eternity Shroud, but that's going to require a total rebuild of the character. So if I chose to go down this route, it would be a new build video, and it would be a high budget build. The unique ones, Obliteration, which is easy to get, and Void Battery, which is rare and very expensive, are worthy of your consideration, or you can just look for rare ones. The gloves can be upgraded from Hrim Sorrow pretty easily. Essence of Horror crafted gloves are something that you should absolutely consider, and I want to bring up what Essence of Horror gloves will look like. So let's just jump across to the mod that Essences of Horror give. And that mod is socketed gems have plus 3.5% base critical strike chance. This is a huge amount. This is more than we get from the entire link of increased critical strike support on our Herald device. And so we'd be able to drop increased critical strikes and replace it with Ice Bite. This is a huge upgrade when you can get to this point, but it adds a new problem. Now you're going to need to fix up some of your conversion issues. You're only converting 60% damage with Glacial Cascade by default. You're going to want to find another source of the remaining 40%. At this point, you have the Long Winter Threshold Jewel. You could use two copies of this jewel. Again, perfectly rolled and with good Val implicit, should be available in the middle of the league, perhaps for an Exalted Orb, if you want a single good implicit and 15% increased damage. Or alternately, Glacial Cascade has a Helmet enchant that solves all of your conversion issues as well. It's a pretty rare enchant, as every single helmet enchant is pretty rare, but it will be available to trade in a trade league. Depending on the popularity of the build, it could be available for 10 chaos on a serviceable base, or it could be more like 3 or 4 exalts. We'll have to figure that out as we go. But those are your options for dealing with conversion once you get past using Harim Sorrow. The Amulet slot offers a lot. +1 to the level of all cold skills, +1 to the level of all intelligence skill gems, and more and more and more. There's lots of damage you can get on the Amulet slot. In the path of building that I link, the Amulet slot is taken up with a primarily defensive amulet, and you can do much better than that. Belts offer damage and also reduced cooldowns as a Shaper mod. In addition to this, belts offer all sorts of defensive mods, and you're going to need to balance between defense and offense in the belt slot. Rare ones for Spellslingers are a whole different kettle of fish, and crafting these will need a new video entirely. Lastly, you may wish to consider using a shield in your offhand. I've set this up with a second wand, but there's no real need to go 2 wands. Wand and shield is fine. And the unique shield Mistwall is something you could conceivably build around, although that's something that would be, again, an aspirational goal. You'd need to change a lot of other things in the tree, and so ultimately that would be a new build video guide. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. I am thinking of league starting with this, which is something that is going to be a little bit of a risk because, once more, we don't know how Spellslinger is going to feel in practice. But I think that the theory is there. I think that this is only going to be a middle tier build. I don't think it's going to be amazing. I also think that you could use Arc as an alternative payload instead of Glacial Cascade. That will change the tree, that will change some of the scaling, but the tree will be mostly similar. Anyways, comments or questions far away below. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you have a good one, and all of the links you need will be in the description of the video.